September 2017, The Atlantic released an article by Jean Twenge entitled, "Have Smartphones Destroyed a Generation?" In the article, Twenge detailed research from her book, iGen, asserting that adolescents are on the brink of the largest mental health crisis in history. This article sent shockwaves through our culture, and Twenge ended up on multiple major news media outlets sharing more of her research. Fast forward 8 years to 2025, we now live in a time that's confirmed many of Twenge's predictions and affirmed much of the data she relayed from her research. Depression, anxiety, self-harm, eating disorders are on the rise. At the close of 2024, Oxford Dictionary's word of the year was brain rot, stating that the phrase gained prominence in 2024 with its frequency of use increasing 230% from the year before. The actual definition of brain rot is the perceived decline of a person's mental or intellectual state, especially due to consuming an excessive amount of trivial or challenging online content. I don't know about you, but brain rot is an apt descriptor of how I often feel. I go through life feeling like I'm in a fog, and I actually strive to be cautious of how I use my smartphone. But what about preteens and teens who spend multiple hours a day on devices? Those 14 to 18 years old, on average, spend anywhere from 7 to 9 hours online. In many ways, they're never offline. What sort of brain rot do they feel? Sarah Zylstra, a senior writer at the Gospel Coalition and author of Social Sanity in an Insta World, joined me to talk a little bit about her story. Listen to Sarah share a little bit about her struggles with social media.
I have something of an advantage because I didn't get on social media until I was 27. So, it was around before then, but I was just out of college when Facebook sort of opened up to the world.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so I was like in graduate school, I was newly married. I didn't really have time for it. I didn't have time for it, in fact, until I was a stay-at-home mom with my oldest son. So he was about 1 year old and I was 27 when I first was like, well, what's this? And I started to explore it. And at first it was Facebook where everybody was. It was the only really place you could go. And it was a lot of fun. People weren't posting a lot. Certainly they were not online all the time. I didn't have a smartphone at the beginning. And so it was just a desktop when I could go and pop in there. Definitely, it gradually took up more and more time. If you are a stay-at-home mom and you have toddlers, they are cute. And then for about the first 5 years, until he was in 5th grade, I homeschooled. And John, the cute pictures you can take of children homeschooling and doing homeschool activities is just like a mountain of things you can take pictures of.
Oh, yeah.
It was very cute. I had a very cute couple of years, and that corresponded with like, ooh, I can put this on my social media page. And my friends were also homeschoolers. We felt a little isolated, but we could look at each other's pictures and sort of feel like we were doing this together.
Mm-hmm.
As my kids got older is when that started to feel more uncomfortable because I didn't like posting embarrassing things of them, or as they, it just feels weird, like with an older kid. So I stopped posting about them. I started working more. So I could post my own work, but that felt very self-serving, right?
Sure,
to be like, hi friends, would you like to read what I wrote today?
Mm-hmm.
No, you wouldn't want to do that. And so I stopped posting about that. I didn't ever post about hot takes because I didn't know what to say. And so I didn't post it. And so then pretty soon I was down to lurking, which I actually think, John, is where a lot of people are. Even now is like, well, I don't know what to say. So I'm just sitting here. Which means you're not even getting a dopamine hit from having people interact with you. You are literally just watching other interactions, and that has not as many dopamine hits. And so the experience is I'm kind of bored or I'm tired and I'm looking forward to like maybe there will be something interesting online. So I look online. It's maybe fun for a couple of seconds. Maybe I see a post or two that's interesting. And then I look up and it has been 45 minutes, which is way too long for me to be on here because I'm supposed to be doing something else. And by the time I get off, I don't like social media. I don't like myself. I don't like how I just used that time. It felt gross by the end.
Yeah.
Still couldn't get off though. Usually it takes a kick for someone to get off. And so it was actually working through the Scrolling Alone podcast and the Social Sanity book that made me realize, as I'm talking to other girls and women about how little they are getting out of social media and how much they are putting in, it was a mirror for myself. Like, I am also putting in too much and getting out way too little. And that was the kick that I needed. So I got off about 2.5 years ago from everything. What was really interesting to me is, so we did the social sanity book first, which was for moms, right? And we did a survey of, I think, a couple thousand moms. It was just the people on the TGC list. So it wasn't like an official survey, but we asked them a bunch of questions and it was really revealing. They primarily said they went to social media to connect with friends and family. That was one of the things that they said. That wasn't a surprise. Their biggest complaint with it was the amount of time they spent there. And that was my biggest complaint too. I just thought that was everyone's biggest complaint. But then somewhere along the line, someone said to us, you need to look into the younger generations, which back then would be like Gen Z, the lower millennials. Like, they're experiencing social media differently than you guys are, which was a new idea for us. We're like, oh, really? So once I started asking them questions, they aren't struggling with time. Young women are struggling the most with comparison, specifically body comparison, right? They're too young to have a house or a car that they would be proud of or be excited to show, but they are very, like, what they have at that point is their body. And so they're very, very much into body comparison, and it is toxic for them because they're all editing themselves. They're taking really cute pictures. They're wearing smaller and smaller clothes, which, by the way, has then introduced a problem for any boy who is on social media to keep himself pure. It's almost impossible. And so it was just like, and they would say to me how much they didn't like to be on there. They would sometimes take breaks if they were like, a girl told me, I'll get up on a Saturday morning and I'll be feeling well rested and good about my day. And then I look at social media and see some other friends that are out to brunch. And immediately I start to think, how come I'm not out at brunch? Do I even have any friends? Would any friends go out to brunch with me? Does anybody like me? Like, all of a sudden she's in this spiral where 10 minutes before she was like, I'm doing good. I've got my day in front of me. I'm planned out. I'm doing what I need to. And all of a sudden it sends her into a spiral. And then other girls would say that to me too. Like, as soon as someone posts, I got this internship, or I'm dating this boy, or I just got engaged, or whatever it might be, all of a sudden it sends all the other girls into a spiral of insecurity. And I couldn't believe that they would stay on there when they were telling me over and over how awful it made them feel. And then I thought, well, I'm doing the same thing, right?
I would assume that Sarah's struggle is a struggle many of you share. I've been there before and continue to see addictive tendencies that I have with my own devices. If you're tuning in to the RYM podcast for the first time, my name is John Parrott and I serve as the Director of Resources for Reformed Youth Ministries. RYM was founded in 1972 and seeks to serve the church in their efforts to reach and equip youth for Christ. Over the course of the next several weeks, we'll be talking to many experts under the theme of digital Christianity. How can we use technology wisely? Are there various social media platforms Christians should abstain from? How can parents and pastors, schools and churches push back on the wave of artificial intelligence? Or should we push back at all or fully embrace it? These are the types of questions we'll seek to wrestle with, and we have a host of guests in various fields who will help us with this. Today, however, I want us to think broadly about our engagement with technology. You know, when I started to plan for this mini-series, I do what I always do. I take out my journal and begin to scribble away. For any journal-loving friends out there, it's a minimalism art journal with a Papermate Flare pen, which is going to sound like nonsense to many of you, and some of that detail might sound absurd, but it's a bit ironic, and I'm sharing that for a reason. I'm using the tactile process of an actual pen and paper to think more deeply about the digital age, this increasingly disembodied world that we're living in. The tactileless, if you will, world, the life that we're living and the life that our children are growing up in. But through my scribbling and brainstorming, Andrew Noble was an expert that came to mind. While he would dismiss this label of expert, he's a voice that the church needs to think more deeply about this technological age. He's currently pursuing PhD work in this field. He writes frequently about technology and hosts a podcast, What Would Jesus Tech? For those who listen to this podcast for some time, Andrew has been on before. Now, you'll hear from Andrew throughout this series. But first, I wanted you to hear about the concept of faithful presence that Andrew discusses and how that applies to our use of technology.
Yeah, so James Davison Hunter, it's really interesting because there's been some negative pushback on it since then. So someone like James Wood, solid Christian, great writer, he's written against kind of faithful presence because he doesn't think sometimes it's courageous enough and that it speaks Christian conviction in the public squares. Because sometimes faithful presence, it's like you're just present, but are you courageous? Are you speaking? And I think just to unpack it, faithful presence, you're faithful to God, you're faithful to your Christian convictions, but you're present in all of life and all spheres of life. So he basically would unpack scripture in this. And it's interesting because he wrote the book in maybe 2012 or so, before really the rise of all the social media and digital stuff. But he did make the point in his book about how, we're in this online and people are getting caught up in these online worlds. So faithful presence is about being physically embodied, being present. The incarnation is not Jesus sending a text message to us or responding to a post on Facebook. He became flesh. And so too, we need to be enfleshed, embodied in communities around us, and we need to be faithful to God in each sphere of our lives. So if you send your kids to a school and you end up volunteering at that school, are you faithful to God in that sphere? And so, so it's basically a hermeneutic, so to speak. It's an approach, a heuristic, a way of life to think about, am I being faithful to God in every sphere? And you can kind of talk about the different postures that Christians ought to have when it comes to culture, and it applies to technology as well. Should we have like a careful posture? Is one kind of in the middle? Then on the other side is like courageous, which might be identified more on the right side of things in terms of the political spectrum. And you see some of my friends who maybe were a big fan of the Gospel Coalition or other related organizations 10 years ago, they've kind of said, the Gospel Coalition isn't courageous enough. They're not bold enough. And then on the other side, you have this contrite approach, contrite being like, we need to apologize for the wrongs that Christians have done in the past. We need to recognize things like systemic racism and things like that. Kevin DeYoung has kind of created these categories starting with C, and I'm missing one, but he kind of argues for the value of this category of carefulness, that we can't just be courageous. We can't just be contrite. Those are good biblical things to be, but we need to be prudent and use wisdom and discernment. And that's kind of what faithful presence is getting at. Discern, how can I be faithful to God where I'm at? And so it's interesting to kind of reflect back on that. And some people have done this. I forget if it was like J.Y. Kim or something about like, are we supposed to be faithfully present online? Like, how much do we consider online and internet culture to be part of the culture? And I think sometimes Christians, it's like, yes, embodiment. Yes, Jesus came to live in the flesh. Yes, in 2 John, it says, I have much to write to you, but I would much rather be with you face to face so that our joy might be complete. That's what it says in 2 John. And so we certainly, as Christians, should prioritize physical relationships, physical embodiment. We should not tune into church. We should sit in a pew or a chair or stand up and sing. Yes, but internet culture is part of our culture. Mm-hmm. It is a place that people are at, and we should be there. We shouldn't ignore it. It's part of how people talk, how people communicate. In 1 John, the same phrase is used, so that our joy might be complete. It's actually used in relationship to him writing the letter. I wrote this to you so that my joy might be complete. He's like saying, I need to use this technology of papyrus and ink in order for my joy to be complete, because I need to say something to you. I need to, it's not self-expression in First John. You can read it. There's a lot different than that. So I think it's different than what most people think of when they post online. But he's using the medium of that technology of the day in order to serve others. And he's saying that it even brings joy. It's a part of the culture of the day, was using papyrus and ink. Very expensive at the time. People are like, why would you ever pay $150 for a Twitter profile? It's like, well, Paul spent, $2,000 in his day just to write the book of Romans, or more than that. There's different people who've tried to calculate how much would it have cost to write and then send something like the book of Romans. It was super expensive back then. And yeah, we can even invest money in technology, in social media, and be present in those places. And we should have ministries that are doing that. And that's why we should have podcasts. We should have Christians on TikTok. We should have Christians on other platforms. Maybe not TikTok. TikTok's a complicated one. But Christians should be in these places. I don't think I would want to send Christian missionaries to a strip club. So I have my limits. Yes. There are some places where I'm like, too much sin going on there. This is not helpful. But there's a lot of places that if you have Christian virtues, if you have wisdom, prudence, if you have courage, if you have a pursuit of justice in your core and you have habituated that in your life, you can be in some of these places that are filled with sin. People might even accuse you of being in that place, of being a drunkard, being a sinner. But you're going to be in those places for the sake of sharing the gospel and loving people, because people are in those places. So I think we should have, like I sometimes say to like young adults. So they're not teenagers, they're young adults. I say to them, some of you need to get off social media. Maybe most of you need to delete your profiles, but some of you need to post more. Some of you need to get more active. You need to upgrade your camera. You need to be making more and better content. There's a place for digital missionaries in our world today.
It's interesting to hear Andrew wrestle with TikTok here. Should Christians use TikTok, since there's so much controversy surrounding it? Actually, we'll be talking to Alan Noble, not to be confused with Andrew Noble, but Alan will appear on a later episode to focus solely on TikTok and his strong assertion that Christians should abstain from the platform. But that's a later episode. For now, Andrew and I continue talking about the gray area of TikTok, and he shares a pretty amazing story. But I've used the strip club example with my students as well, of there's places where we have to draw the line. And, maybe we would say, okay, maybe the parking lot of some strip clubs, maybe trying to talk to people outside before they go in, maybe even trying to talk to some of those who are owners of it, all that participants in it on the way out, and of course, I'm not saying let's get really strict on boundaries and all of this, but even thinking of maybe some of the platforms where we might draw the line. Okay, what is the parking lot of, TikTok? What are some ways to kind of maybe get in those boundaries where you said we might even be called, hey, you're participating in this because we're willing to kind of get our hands dirty, so to speak, to make sure the gospel spread. So maybe just some thoughts there, unpacking that a little bit.
Yeah. I think one of the temptations, and maybe this is true of Baptists in particular, maybe not, is to approach some of these ethical questions as okay, there's going to be a line and we need to draw it and we need to figure out what's on one side and what's on the other side. And I think in scripture, like a friend of mine the other day, he and I were talking about the same concept, and he said to me, well, Paul was very specific to Christians in his day about how they were to live. And I said, really? Where is Paul very specific? He's like, well, the first half of his letters were theology, and then the second half were very specific. I was like, tell me where he was specific. And he used the head covering example, and I was like, sure enough, on Sunday mornings, he's very specific. Like when in the gathered church, it needs to be orderly. But where else? Give me another example. And he just couldn't come up with one. He's like, he's going to get back to me. So I'm still waiting for him to get back to me. That was a week ago. David, if you're listening to this podcast, maybe you can come up. Do you have any examples of where Paul is very specific?
No,
instruction to Christians?
I'm thinking, as he's talking about overseers in the church, and I mean maybe the pastoral epistles a little
Mhm.
bit more. There's some specificity, but I think it's even kind of getting at what you're saying. That Sunday morning's very specific, and
Yep.
then a little more broad, vague, I guess maybe. So yeah, no,
Yeah, so I just like 1 Corinthians 8 to 1 Corinthians 10, Paul talks about the freedom he has in Christ. There's so much freedom that exists for Christians. Yeah, there's going to be other people that are worshiping idols or eating meat that's been sacrificed to idols. It's just meat. Those idols are just wood. So it's no biggie. Like, go for it. But if it's going to harm someone's conscience, then okay, you need to be careful about that. So there's principles there. Like, that's the idea, is that you need to read the room, see how your behavior is going to affect others. That's one of the things Paul's getting at there. So maybe for you to be on TikTok and just casually using it is going to influence others in your friend group, that TikTok is kind of this neutral thing. It doesn't really matter if we're using it. And it actually isn't a good influence on your friends, because as someone who maybe listens to podcasts like this or has a youth pastor who's talked to you about this, that something like TikTok is shaping you and forming you. And it's all about instant gratification. It's all about you. It's all about entertainment. And therefore, the habit that is formed in TikTok use over time is going to lead not to something that's like Christ. It's going to lead to something that's not like Christ. And so that's kind of the category that I'd want to teach. Rather than drawing a line in the sand, I'd want to instead teach, how is this helping you become more or less like Jesus Christ? And there's been lots of ways that people have talked about breaking down Jesus Christ. One of the ways to do it is to talk about virtue, the characteristics and habits of living, such that, are you generous? Are you kind? Are you self-controlled? You need to become more like Jesus. And is this use of the technology helping you become more like that? And that's something that you don't have to be, 50, 70 years old to think about. You can think about that as a 12-year-old. God has gifted you with a mind. You don't have to sit back and wait for someone to tell you a rule. No. You're 12 years old now. You're going to become an adult soon. God has gifted you with a lot of skills and wisdom, even at your age. Don't let anybody look down on you. Use your mind. Don't look to me to make a rule. You create the rule for yourself. You figure out, with wisdom, with prudence, with self-control, is this forming you into a person that reflects the characteristics of Jesus? Or are you becoming more like, I don't know, just someone in the world that's just indistinguishable from the kinds of people that Christians ought to be? So that's one way of thinking about the TikTok issue, is not a clear line in the sand now. Like, use some wisdom here. And I'm going to push back on the desire for a clear line. It's kind of like the whole like dating question. How far can I go in the relationship with my girlfriend without crossing the line? It's the same thing. The person who asked that, it's like, okay, do we have more than 10 seconds right now? Because I can tell you with 10 seconds, but what's your goal with this question? Is your goal to honor God? Are you living for him? Or are you trying to make sure your parents and pastor don't get upset with you? Because what we need to care about is your heart.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the heart behind that, digging into, okay, why are you asking me that question to begin with? Yeah, and you said too that for some students, you want to encourage them to be more active on social media. And so maybe, parse that out a little bit and just elaborate on that for us.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm wary about talking about this because I know some people would push back, and there's always a question of like, well, are they mature enough? What age, and for myself, for my own kids, like, yeah, I'm gonna draw a line in the sand. I'm gonna say, yeah, no social media till you're 16. It just doesn't make sense. Now I'm doing that as a parent, knowing what I know, and I think it would make sense for churches to kind of agree on that in order to make it easier to socially accommodate that kind of approach. But yeah, I do think that there are a lot of people who spend a lot of time. You can look at the research, you can see that it's not just like 10, 20 minutes a day on some of these platforms. We're talking like 3 to 6 hours per day. And a lot of that content ends up leading in certain directions. One interesting facet of our culture right now is that we have men and women more than ever in disagreement with each other on political issues. Regardless of what the stances actually are, what we find is that women tend to spend more time on Instagram, men spend more time on TikTok, and those platforms are shaping people in certain directions on a political spectrum. And it's just so obvious, the big idea. Social media forms you into a certain kind of person. So we need to be super careful about it, but also the stuff on social media does also form people, not just in the way that it works, but also in the content itself. And so I think about guys like Gavin Ortland who are making these thoughtful YouTube videos, against the Orthodox Church or whatever. And he's using his platform in order to, speak to certain issues related to apologetics. And then if he were to take some of those pieces of content and shrink them down into clip-size bites and even share them on TikTok, I'm like, yeah, I'm okay with that. I think some of these platforms are best used to direct people out of them to other places. I forget if I shared this story before, but there's a pastor in Calgary and he has a TikTok account. And he met this woman through TikTok. She said that she was scrolling on TikTok and she just couldn't get away from him. His videos kept coming up on her feed. And she wasn't a Christian and she just kept seeing them. And eventually she said, fine, I'll join your Bible study, your online Bible study over Zoom. Went to it one time. She was fascinated by the fact that the Bible actually says things. She just didn't have any idea that the Bible says stuff and that we could use the Bible. She just had this ancient document idea. And anyway, she ends up inviting her sister, and she didn't live in Calgary, yet this pastor did. And the pastor said after a while, okay, you need to join a local church. And so he looked up a good biblical church, and guess what? He found our church.
No way.
And so this woman shows up to our church with her sister or sister-in-law? No, her sister, and then her other friend. And she says, I've been saved through TikTok. I want to get baptized. So for all the people who are like, Christians shouldn't be on TikTok, I'm like, yeah, I hear you, sure. I get the deforming effects, but I also want to see people saved. And I'm so glad that those 3 women got baptized at our church and are following Jesus. I'm just praising God for that. And I'm thankful for that pastor in Calgary that helped disciple them through that medium.
Yeah, that's incredible. And of course, maybe some of the pushback would be, well, yeah, that's just kind of this small sample size compared to all the other, filth, everything else that's on there, the addictive tendencies, all that kind of stuff. What would you say to somebody like that might push back just a little bit?
Yeah, so don't go on it then. I don't know. If the pastor can make his own decision. I think he doesn't seem to be getting caught up in worldly things. So sure, small amounts of Christian. I'm not saying every Christian should be on TikTok. And I've thought about this. Can we have Christian, a normie Christian? Because one of the approaches to this is either you're a digital evangelist, a missionary online, and you're very intentional about that, or you're off. It's kind of like a black and white approach. And I've wondered, is it possible to just be someone who uses these platforms, intentionally likes Christian stuff so that they see it? I've sometimes talking to teenagers and their girl, they're like, well, Instagram actually for me brings a lot of Christian content because of how my algorithm is trained to send me more Christian content. And I'm like, yeah, I hear you. In moderation, maybe. Okay, you're 17 years old now. You're making these decisions for yourself. Okay, I hear you on that. So maybe there's a place for that, but I totally understand the caution. And yeah, it shouldn't be a majority of Christians. I think a lot of us should be spending our times in person. It's only a select few that have the character for it. Pastors, those sorts of people who can handle the conversations in the parking lot at a strip club and the kind of intensity of those situations. That those are going to be more difficult situations, and you're going to be tempted in ways that you're not tempted at a parking lot at a church.
As you can hear from this brief conversation, this is a gray area for the Christian, without a doubt. But I want to leave you with the concept of faithful presence for today. What does that look like for you as a youth leader, as a parent, a lead pastor, a teacher, a coach. Wrestle with this concept and seek by God's grace to apply this in your own life. Next week, we'll talk more with Andrew about the importance of technology, and we'll start to talk a bit about how technology changes us. We'll ask some of our guests what their relationship with their smartphone is like. So be sure to tune in next week to hear more. Digital Christianity is a podcast brought to you by Reformed Youth Ministries. For more information about our student conferences, training events, and resources, be sure to visit rym.org. If you're enjoying this season of the podcast, be sure to pass this along to others who may benefit from it. Stay tuned for more.